I'd like to introduce two folks who have had a really outsized impact on NJ organic agriculture. NOFA New Jersey Board of Director Al Johnson and Rutgers University soil scientist Joseph Heckman. Thank you. You're the man.
So we have such a great keynote speaker this year that it's taken two of us to introduce him. But my role is really to give you a little bit of history, and the history is really related to what's going on today. NOFA was founded in 1971. No chapters at that point. NOFA New Jersey was formed 40 years ago, so we're in our 40th year. But the first 8 or 9 years of NOFA, there was no winter conferences. There was summer events, but there's nothing in the wintertime. The first event was actually called the Biological Soil Management Seminar, which was in Randolph, Vermont. And so what we did, we wanted to get 3 good speakers that knew a lot about soils, because back then, not a lot of people knew about soils. There were 3 obvious people or organizations, I should say. One was a guy named Win Wei, who was the soil agronomist for University of Vermont, always a proponent of organic practices. The other was our NOFA's founder, Samuel Kamen, who just was a fanatic about studying everything about soil. And the third, we said that the one institution that really was in our area, this happened in Vermont again, that really knew more than anybody about soil health was Woods End Lab. So we called up Woods End Lab and said, Will, can you come please talk? Well, Will wasn't there. He was in Europe. So he sent his partner, Bob Parnes. But we've had that relationship with Woods End Lab for the last 40 years, 44 years, I guess. And, you know, they're still the same prestige of the work that they do. And we'll hear about that today. Joe is going to actually introduce Will.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Al. So Al and I worked together to recruit our speaker, our keynote speaker, and he's in great demand. He can't be everywhere, but so we are very, very lucky to have our keynote speaker, Will Brinton. And but before we get to the introduction, because I'm a professor at Rutgers, I'd just like to see a show of hands. How many Rutgers students are in the room? Could you show? Great. And I know a lot more wanted to attend, but we're sold out. So anyway, it's great to see you here. I really got interested in bringing our keynote here because he wrote a really interesting article in Acres USA about soil health and how that's such a rage. There's so much emphasis on soil health today. And the gist of his article in Acres USA about soil health was how the organic movement was really left out of it and was not getting recognition, even though they were on this soil health program long before the USDA or the Soil Health Institute and so on ever got interested in it. So let's give credit where it's due. And so our keynote speaker has really been a great friend of the organic community for a long time. He's a scientist, and to partner with the organic community is great. And then you have in your program, you can read it yourself, about his bio and so on, but I just want to add a few things to it. So he's a native of Pennsylvania, grew up in Quaker communities of Chester and Lancaster counties, not so far from here. And he went to a school at a Quaker boarding school where they had a program where they raised the food on the farm for the students at the school. And that was at a boarding school in Ohio. And then he went into a farm and wilderness training program that led to his new roots in Maine, and that's where he lives and works today. And the other thing is, during his education, he got connected with Albert Schatz, and there's a connection here to Rutgers, because Albert Schatz did the research in the lab here at Rutgers under the mentorship of Selma Waxman, who later got and won the Nobel Prize for medicine for the discovery of streptomycin, which was used to treat tuberculosis. And so really now it's recognized that both Albert Schatz and Selma Waksman were awarded the Nobel Prize for that discovery. And so he worked and was mentored, our keynote speaker was mentored through an experimental college program working with Albert Schatz. And so anyway, it's great to have our keynote speaker, Will Brinton, come on up, and thank you for being here. Let's start out with a round of applause for our speaker.
Thank you for that. That's a wonderful warm-up. A speaker in my position might at this point say, let's just cut to questions and answers and then leave. I actually witnessed that recently at a great lecture in Europe. A well-known person who's been researching humus for over 45 years was the keynote speaker, and they did a great build-up for him, and he stood up and said, I'll take questions and answers now. And then he left to a standing ovation. And I thought, boy, I want to be that kind of person one day where you just can show up. And I know a few people like that, though. I probably won't get away for it, and they told me don't try to pull that off. So I'm really happy to be here and to try to introduce my theme in the biggest way that I can think about what we all do, all farmers. We are harvesters of sunlight. And most particularly, I think the organic movement, what it's trying to do is harvest that sunlight in the most authentic way possible. What could be a simpler explanation for it? Agriculture has become so complicated nowadays with the tools and technology that we've completely lost sight of the simple process of harvesting the sunlight as naturally as possible, knowing that this unbelievably magical process of photosynthesis is driving this whole planet. I recently did a workshop in northern Germany on moor soils, or what they call moor, you might call it peat soils. And I was astounded to meet a plant that the profile of the plant tells the whole story. Let me try to describe that. What we're looking at here is an entire Sphagnum cupisatum plant that I pulled right out of the bog. The institute is called BIOS, and it's just doing amazing work on bringing our attention to the huge reserve of carbon in these moor soils. But this plant at the top is photosynthesizing, pulling it down into plant tissue and making soil at the bottom. So that's the peat moss that it forms from the plant itself, all in that one plant. Now, how much period of time is going by in doing this? Well, it's now been documented the plant is making soil at 1 millimeter a year. That's not a lot, maybe a 1/16 of an inch. So in 10 years, it's made about an inch of soil. 100 years, 1 meter. And the moors that we went out and did our workshop on had 10 meters of soil formed by these plants, which took them exactly 10,000 years since the last ice age. So that is the whole story of soil formation if you capture it as the essence of sunlight and photosynthesis. Now, we cannot do as well as that, obviously, because we're not farming peat, but it started a huge movement in Germany that's now spreading to the world. Do you know that 3% of the world's surface is covered by peat moors, and they have more carbon in them than all the forests of the world? This is an astounding discovery that's been made only in the last 10 years as measurements are being made. So if you have moorish soils or peat-like soils on your farm, honor them and protect them because they are these great storehouses. And it's the essence of photosynthesis that's driving it. Now, they are starting to work with farmers in Europe who are farming the moor soils, which has now fallen into some amount of disgrace. But these soils give up nitrogen without any nitrogen fertilizer, enough to grow good crops every year, but at a loss of carbon dioxide. So They're trying to devise new ways of doing this. But I'll just leave off the subject there of this plant. More than anything else is how we harvest sunlight, and it should be the driving force of all our farming that we not lose sight of this. Here's another way to capture sunlight in the soil. Nearby this workshop, we visited some organic and biodynamic farms, and this was a nearby biodynamic farm, and I looked at that and said, my goodness, you know, this is what I call the up-down cycle of building soil health and soil fertility. You have two movements there. If you can quickly recognize it, you've got this soil, it looks like it's stabbing down into the depths. That is almost 3/4 of a meter or 3 feet deep in the soil. And obviously the plant roots are all the way down here. You can see some of them have followed these channels all the way down. So the plant roots are down much deeper than we ever test soil. So we don't even know what the minerals and nutrients are there, and they're pulling that all the way up and depositing it at the top. So the plants are harvesting the soil for nutrients, bringing it up thanks to the energy of photosynthesis, and meanwhile the earthworms are drilling these holes down into the soil and carrying the humus down. So we always talk about, we're going to build soil, we're going to make soil health happen. Just let it happen, right? The whole essence of farming is to manage this motion without too much disturbance. And to farm is to disturb. There's no way you can get around that. These farms have done remarkably. I visited a farm that had been 30 years organic, had never used any imported fertilizers, and that's just an amazing feat. And of course it required lots of pasture land, it required animals in the rotation, and they had huge CSAs, they had farm stores, all being managed and supported by this process. So, okay, let's get to the debate side of this. Organic has always been a pitched battle for me. I nearly got thrown out of land grant in New England back in the 70s when I said I wanted an organic program. And they belittled that and said, you won't get that here, son. And that's when I met Albert Schatz, and he said, nobody should talk to you like that. I'll get you into a program. But I started addressing this topic that people were calling we organic people ideologues for our purity and so on. But look at this. This is the textbook cover page. I found this in my uncle's collection from 1937. Man in a Chemical World. And look at the caption. Chemical industry upheld by pure science sustains the production of man's necessities. So that is the ideology of the chemicalization of farming. I'm not saying it's 100% wrong, but it is an ideology, and that has sustained this world since this time into the present. And now really what we're doing is we're saying we're going to shift the whole paradigm to a more nature-based ideology, which you will, comes from my first slide there. But I just like to put this out there. I posted this recently on a university agronomist website who was teasing the organic people for their beliefs and so on, and I said, and here is your belief system, okay, so let's call equal on that. But this continues to be a theme anywhere I go in the world. So once again, let's keep sunlight in mind and have a different perspective on sunlight. When we look at this picture here, I would say our currency in organic farming is organic matter. So take that middle picture, that's our trade, whether it's hay, grains, and so on. You are harvesting and handling organic matter, photosynthate, and we usually work from here to here. The whole system is where it's all being integrated, but the scientists bring it in from the point of view, what I call reductionism, and address it only as carbon. And we are living now in the carbon age. And I've done quite a bit of work in it, but once you go to the carbon level, you fail to see the bigger picture, that there's organic matter in different forms, and then actually there's the whole system that we're trying to manage. And it's a tremendous challenge, particularly as the scientists were expected to reduce, and take it down to the small essential mechanism, if you will. Whereas farming, particularly organics, is to build, and build out to holistic, but comprehensive whole system analysis. So this is the tremendous challenge. So what we do in science is we break the whole into parts. That's my operation in Maine there, and these are all the soils from it going through the lab. And as soon as we do that, you lose sight of the whole completely. When the analysis was completed, you know, is there a pointer on this thing? Let's see. I don't think so. Anyway, when the analysis was completed, there were samples there from neighboring fields that were tested completely differently in the lab. And the lab guy said these could be samples from different farms. So they had lost the whole picture of it. And I had to put it back together. And now software companies and field workers are trying to recapture the wholeness when you get all this data and it doesn't really tell you, you know, why is one field 30% higher in carbon than the next field, and so on and so forth. So this is the new challenge, is to try to build back the whole picture of the system that we're dealing with and try to escape this partial and mechanistic analysis of the system. And it's a tremendous challenge. And this is science's contribution to the world, you understand? And yet science's contribution to the world is breaking down our views and our sense of grasping wholeness and even belittling it to the point where the data is supposed to speak more than the experience of the whole farm. And I can go out in the fields in the summer and see the differences the lab found, but I can just see them. And they're not just striated by field, of course. You can do spatial maps, and I'll show an example of a paper we just published on spatial distinctions on farms, and it begins to come alive again. Just as an example of how to shift our thinking, I want to use this example of carbon dioxide. It's such a huge debate and discussion now, carbon sequestration and so on, ad absurdum. But let's just take CO2 as it gets into the atmosphere, wherein is all the debate. If you take a bare field and you farm like this, and organic doesn't really farm like this. This is actually shot in the Palouse, Washington. It's typical wheat farming. There's respiration in the soil. Where's the CO2 going? It's going to be leaving immediately and going straight to the atmosphere. In an organic system, where's the CO2 going? We're doing studies now that the CO2 coming out of the soil never gets to the atmosphere. It goes right back into the plant matter at the soil surface. And I believe now this is the essence of CO2 management farming, is that we capture the CO2 before it gets out of the system. Now, canopy studies are now being done to try to determine how much of the soil release of CO2 can be captured. I've been working on a paper now. It's been sent back twice by critical reviewers saying you haven't made the point well enough yet, and so on. And this is the way science is. It plods along incredibly slowly and very critically to see, is this a new way to look at it? But I believe it is. And it changes your whole sense of how you talk about carbon dioxide, for example. Okay, let's now jump into kind of my historical perspective on soil health. I'm going to present maybe 4 or 5 germinal studies that I was involved with a long time ago, where we in the organic and biodynamic community created the concept of soil health. And I have to tell you, shoved it into the face of the conventional agricultural science establishment. They took it most unwillingly at the time. This was an amazing study sponsored by the German Ministry of Agriculture in '77, comparing, they found 9 farms, conventional versus organic, that had exact similar characteristics in size, soil type, and management. The only difference being using chemicals, not using chemicals, and they wrote a report on it. It took 3 years I was at the institute in Germany as an intern. Albert Schatz had sent me there and said, this is a good place to study. We were studying when the report came out, and it was so shocking to the conventional establishment at the time, they didn't really know what to do. They did not ever release a report publicly. They sent it to 9 agencies in Germany, and you had to call them and beg to get a copy of the report. They compared the soils on the farms, and this is just a summary of some of the attributes. We call them indicators of soil health that they found on the organic or biodynamic farm soils. Up to 50% more microbial respiration, just as one example. The nitrogen mineralization cycle was 14% better. That's an amazing fact. If you're fighting not using chemical nitrogen and the threat of lower yields, if you have a higher N-min cycle, that's going to pick you up again, and it's a natural cycle. They studied a group of enzymes associated with carbon cycling. It was very sophisticated for the 70s, 40% more across the board on these farms. So that means carbon is turning over faster, which is very interesting. They studied the enzymes of the nitrogen cycle, 76% more across all these farms. That means the organic nitrogen cycle is more enlivened and more active. So the plants are actually getting more. They looked at specific microbial groups like Azotobacter, which is so important in soil formation. And Azotobacter and earthworm counts between the two soils were about the same percentage, 400% more on the organic or biodynamic farms than the conventional. And that was just, and these are common tillage farms. There was no, the organic and biodynamic farms all used tillage. But they actually said the tillage was similar between the two systems back then. There's more difference today with emphasis on reduced tillage. So that study came out right at the time that Willie Lockeritz and Barry Commoner and Al Schatz had finished the report at Washington University from the Center for Biology and Natural Systems that really shocked the world, and it was called the economic performance of farms that do and do not use chemicals. They didn't even want to say the word organic in reporting it, but that, when I went to Europe as an intern, I found that report on everybody's desk over there. They said, this changes everything. So one of the institutes I worked at in Sweden had just finished a 17-year full crop rotation study that broke the ground in so many ways. And what they did, I mean, this is us in the field laying out plots, so there were different levels of compost, different levels of manure combined with chemicals, and then 3 different levels of chemical-only farming. That's what the crop rotation looked like on the top. And this institute kept this going perfectly for 17 years, and then when they came out with the report, and I translated it from the Swedish, then the university, Uppsala University, said, okay, we want in on this. And so they got the co-support of the country's major land grant to continue this work. But basically, we were able to distinguish just by looking at earthworms on one axis, on the left side, and soil microbial respiration. Over 17 years, the animal manure systems completely distinguished themselves. There's 3 different types of treatments there. And the 2 different lines are just doing short-term tests and longer-term tests. And look where the NPK plots ended up, way at the bottom. They had lost microbial life in 17 years compared to the controls. And again, this was one of these studies that was so groundbreaking and shocking to the establishment because we were able to show the soils that had been treated chemically now had a much lower nitrogen mineralization cycle. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? You need more nitrogen if your cycle's going down. You need less if your cycle is upturning, as it was in the organically farmed plots. So once again, this really rattled everybody and laid the basis for a whole range of new studies. And these ones came out of Switzerland. Now, the Swiss Institute, it's called the Forschungsinstitut für biologischen Landbau, near Basel. And I was an intern there in the early days when there were 5 employees. Today there are 200. So it's like the world's largest organic funded research center. They laid out plots, and we've seen reports of this research now right into the present. The plots are all still going from the 70s into the current era, comparing all these different management systems. But I want to just highlight a study that brought out that there's anti-nutritional traits that emerge in chemical farming that you do not find in the organic systems. So they had plant compost and manure compost as treatments, providing this much nitrogen, so that's like maybe 10 to 20 tons per hectare of fertilization, and then they matched it with chemical treatments. So what the columns, the solid columns here, are the yields. So the conventional chemical yielded slightly more with spinach, a lot more than the low-treated plant compost. But in the dotted lines, I want to show you, is the nitrate content in the plant tissue at harvest. It was sky high and above recommended health limits in the produce from the chemically treated. This study has been repeated again and again and again. It got published a couple times, and it started a huge backlash among nutritionists in the chemical industry trying to study the nitrate cycle in the human body. And it led to enormous debate because high nitrate causes methylglobemia in infants. And I attended a session at the National Academy of Sciences last year about this problem in America. And the whole Midwest is under a nitrate elevated water situation now, thanks to conventional farming, and it's beginning to show up in the medical world as higher health expenses. So this has come full course. We predicted it, we measured it at the beginning. A lot of scientists criticize these projects and so on and so forth, and scientists can always find something to criticize when you produce a report. Anything that they can come up with. So way back then, we laid the foundation for understanding we could improve nutrition significantly if you just take single traits like this, if we stay away from the chemical fertilizers. Then Germany jumped back in, and Hanover and Gießen University, that are major research centers, produced a doctoral thesis. I met this scientist who did it, and that's the cover of his thesis, called Spoilage Results on Vegetables Grown by Different Methods. And he gave me these pictures from his study. So you have carrots, either cut or carrots that have been rubbed through a shredder, and they put them in sterile Petri dishes and watch them spoil, like in a refrigerator. So the compost-fed carrots, after a week of spoiling, are 1 and 2 up top there. That's low and high compost application. And the chemical fertilizers, low and high, like 100 to 300 units of nitrogen there. So what they were able to find, and they repeated these studies with many crops, is that the plants spoil faster. If you graded them, look at this result of spoilage, the same period of time. The organic shredded carrots held their wholesomeness longer. I mean, you can see fungal formation, which obviously will start to grow on shredded carrots if you try to store them long. But the chemically grown at high nitrogen was in full stage decay and rotting at the same time. So what this implicated, that there are deep-seated changes in the plant metabolism that's causing it to be more vulnerable after harvest. You may get more yield, but it's more vulnerable. And so this then started a new series of studies about yield and relative yield after storage losses, and it was very controversial. I've witnessed fights at universities or at meetings over how far should we take that one. So Sweden jumped back in and said, okay, we're going to highlight now yield trade-offs, high yield trade-offs between organic and conventional systems. And they did it with potatoes. They went on to do it with wheat as well, and bread quality of wheat grown under different systems. And what they found, and I've reproduced these early studies more recently at our lab in Maine. You do a spectrometric scan of a potato cut in half. This thing is shooting light at it from underneath. Looks like that, so you get a full spectrum of how it's reflecting light. So you know when you are preparing potatoes and you cut them and they start browning, sometimes very quickly, well, that's a very significant anti-nutritional quality in plants. And what we found is the conventionally grown ones were browning twice as fast as potatoes grown organically. Once again, there's a whole spoilage issue at stake here. And so this browning phenomena, you can see it beginning to occur. It's now been found in apples. You know how quickly some apples will brown? I bought some apples recently, sliced them up for muesli in the morning, and before I even got to putting them in, they were all brown. And that's enzymatic decay of the plant tissue that kicks in as soon as oxygen is admitted to the plant. Well, now we're finding it is affected. And Sweden did this. They showed that they compared biodynamic farms and conventional farms for gross yield. Of course, the conventional were more, significantly more yield. These are in 100 kilogram units per area. So that's like 6.2 tons in the conventional per hectare, and the other is 5.9, but it was statistically significant. So we always get this thrown at us in the organic community that we have lower yields. And sometimes you have to say yes, but. So they showed the storage losses in the conventional were almost twice as high. And then when they regraded the net yields after storage, guess what? There was no difference. In fact, you could say now we were yielding more. One of the studies I saw, the organic potatoes at the end of storage out-yielded the conventional, but who waits to write the report like that? Who waits to say, and by the way, we stored them, and then we graded them again, and everything has changed. So this goes to the heart of what is nutrition, and in the food service world, this should be of great interest. There's been so much industry pushback on these studies, I cannot believe it. And it just illustrates that we have to keep reaffirming this kind of work and try new methods of evaluating it so that we can stand up to those charges that we're growing less food for a hungry world. Right into more current times. This was the cover of Nature about, let me see, that was 2001. John Reaganold, Washington State University, a friend of mine. I spent pleasant time with him in Washington, but particularly down in California exploring organic and biodynamic vineyards there. His cover article, The Fruits of Organic Farming, brought this right back out because they found organic apples were significantly sweeter than their counterparts. And they did all the taste tests, they did the measurements, they did the tartness tests. They didn't do the spoilage part of it, but we talked a lot about that, should be in there at some point. They did a storage study, though, and look what the results were. After 6 months, organic apples fared significantly better in storage than their conventional counterparts. So you see, once again, 30 years later, it all comes out again. There's something going on here, and the fact that Nature published it is really reassuring, so that if we do our science well, we can stay out there and stay in the limelight, because if we don't do that, there's a sense of a loss that we're not getting credited with what the hard work that we have put into this. I'm just, as a sidebar here, in '87, Reaganold and his team published a study, Long-Term Effects of Organic and Conventional Farming on Soil Erosion. And we are constantly, are we not, being criticized for our tillage? But what was the results of the study? Organic farming had significant less soil losses than conventional farming. Again, that was published in Nature as well. So really, some of the best places were accepting this work and presenting it, and now somehow they've turned the tide on us and are characterizing organic farming tillage as destructive. And you have to begin to question, where is all this coming from? That's a whole nother discussion. Finally, very recently, 2017, the group in Switzerland said, okay, let's stop reporting individual studies. Let's do a meta-study, which is a study of studies. And they published this in a highly esteemed journal, PLOS One. They compared 149 paired organic conventional studies that they found reported using best scientific practices worldwide. Those are the dots of the countries they accessed. And they looked at all the results from a soil perspective. And it almost looks like that study I showed you from the 70s from Germany. Here we go again. So the organic farms had 41% more biomass carbon. Again, this is a worldwide average now. They had 51% more microbial nitrogen, meaning we've got a better organic nitrogen cycle. That kicks into higher nitrogen mineralization, more nutrients for your farm from nature. The PLFA markers, this is a more modern test that's become popular recently, looking at microbial diversity, were significantly higher. Enzymes, I've mentioned them already. More enzymes, dehydrogenase is critical in the whole carbon cycle in soil. It's easy to measure. The CO2 cycle, they said, was 4% more efficient, and that was a whole big discussion. What did they mean? But they used a standard method. Protease, which is effective in working with organic nitrogen, significantly higher across the world on organic soils. What does that tell you? The whole system organically is more alive, and enzymes, just as in our own nutrition as in nature, are significant agents in transitioning compounds into new states that are necessary for the cycle. And this is also another nitrogen. I mean, I always do urease to find, is a farmer using manure or not? Do a urease test. Don't do anything else. If that is high, it means the enzymes are present that convert manure protein into ammonia and then into nitrate for your plants. So again, it all fits together, right? So now I have to address this really nasty topic of the yield gap. If you go to science meetings, they talk about the organic yield gap. And I've read papers that are so gloomy about it, like how can we feed the world with the organic yield gap? There are people now calculating how much more land we will have to tear up to accept the lower yields of organic farms and keep feeding the world. So it gets that incriminating. So we had a conference in New York State just before COVID hit, where two of us dug into this, and this data came out. This is a published paper in one of the major journals up top, and he's saying the yield gap is closing rapidly. What does that mean? It means we're getting better at what we do, are we not? And they're getting worse at what they do, the conventional. So the conventional is in the top. They compared a number of different systems, and this is only a span of 12 years. So when that paper came out, people started scrambling again, saying, wow, the yield gap is narrowing. And then Science magazine published a story showing, and I'll just quote it here, stagnation or collapse of yields will have profound implications for the world food system. And where are they seeing stagnation of yields? In conventional farming. And they plotted regions all over the world in the last, since 1960 to the present, where yields rose spectacularly with the rise of more industrial farming, and now they're all beginning to tail off, and they looked at maize systems, rice, wheat, soybeans. They're tailing off. They also did studies on where are they continuing to rise, because that's important to acknowledge too. And there's places in the world where the yields continue to rise through good breeding practices and better use of chemicals. But this gloomy picture that we're already stagnating and peaking in major areas of the world, combined with the closing of the yield gap, what are the chances that we will be the leaders in 20 or 30 years? What are the chances of that? That will change everything. So you have to just keep doing your good work, because we're approaching the one-to-one line, and the fact that 37% of the world is now in yield stagnation, That's very, very serious. And they don't like to admit this sort of thing. One of the things they discussed was post-harvest spoilage and damage, and that they hadn't evaluated it, but they can see that good harvested crops are not getting in good condition to the consumer who needs them. So it implicates the whole system. So there's a lot of work to do, and the nearness to markets and the fairness of the trade, they did not discuss it, but they indicated social factors are playing a key role in this discouraging picture. But from the organic side, I think we're moving in the right direction here. So trying to kind of summarize my life work with a new soil test, and I launched a new kind of soil health test kind of in the 90s to modernize it, even though we had been doing a kind of a soil quality test up until then. And we just got it published. I worked with the team at Michigan State University. We just got this into Scientific Reports, which is one of the best journals to get something like this right out in the face of science. And we found spatial patterns using historical crop data. And these are spatial images that are 19 years of field crop performance in one image, what you see at the top. So isn't that amazing? That's a farmer's field in the Midwest, and the yellow areas are the low-yielding zones in the field. It almost has a permanent feature to it. So no matter what you do, there's areas of farms and fields that are low-yielding. There could be spots, it could be low water, high water table, something like that, and the blue areas are consistently high yielding. So we're now trying to find that out, but what this study did in breaking the ice was they used our soil health test indicator here and compared it to carbon, and the differences across the farms were in the same proportion, indicating that soil health is now implicated in long-term yield stability. We're no longer talking all these 1 and 2 year studies I see. So what we're exposing here in this paper is that better growth and more soil life is this cause-effect circle, and I don't know where it begins or ends. It's like the chicken and the egg. And the team from Michigan says, well, the plant stability is causing the soil health. And I'm saying the absence of soil health is causing the plant instability. It's almost the same thing. But you can see it's a circular picture here, and it's very, very interesting. I'm really happy in a way we just turned the whole thing on its head in this paper, because everybody's talking about soil health as the cause of everything. And we're saying, oh boy, if you look at the long-term history of a field, it's almost programming you in a particular direction of soil health. How do you treat that? How do you manage that? This is raising really interesting features in terms of if that were your farm, what would you do with those low-yielding areas? If it's scattered like that, probably I'd say do nothing. You just live with it. But we're seeing farms where a whole quadrant of fields is just in that category. And if you keep investing fertilizer time and effort into it, you may be throwing your money away. So you have to understand it more deeply. But it's a tremendous challenge. So I want to do a big shift here and talk about a new dimension of how we fight this battle, because it is a battle we're fighting, moving it into the social arena by highlighting 2 outstanding recent legal cases in which the young people of the world are standing up and suing the adults, basically, and saying enough is enough. And the first really breakthrough case was in Germany back in 2021, led by Louisa Neubauer, who's in the top quadrant there. If you like to follow somebody on Twitter, she's somebody to follow, the most unflappable, steady voice for retooling for a fossil fuel reduced world. But look, I read the court case recently. It went to the German Supreme Court, and they won the case. And so what the German Supreme Court said, all this fossil energy subsidizing that's going into society is damaging their future. And you, as a state, that's your job, to protect your people. And in one of the statements, they brought out the damage to farmland, and I quoted up there, a devaluation of family farm inheritance due to the violation of the state's duty to protect. And that really, thank you. That just, see what they did? They've just lifted this discussion into a whole nother plane. And then, last year, you all remember Montana, this was just an extraordinary case where these young people sued the state saying, you're not spending money on our future and you're allowing the impact of fossil, call it the whole fossil fuel arena, which includes farming, damage our ability to have a healthy, happy future, and they won the case. It was the first one in America. And in a way it was patterned after the German case. There's another one right now on appeal in Alaska that we're following. The same sort of thing. But if we can do this, I mean, think of what it would mean in terms of the reevaluation of the hard, good work we've put into organic farming science being more recognized. Because, in fact, the governments all over the world act like it's not. So just to add a very important new dimension to this, you all know the word ecosystem services, right? It's like the new word about what we've all been doing. Ecosystem services is an expression that really I trace to Stanford University, Paul Ehrlich's early work in the 80s. And what I love about it is he takes everything that nature does for us. It's sweating. So ecosystem services is what nature does for us. And now they're putting a value on it. This first germinal paper goes all the way back to 97. But the value of the world's ecosystem services, you can almost not read the number, it's so big. It was like $70 trillion. And then they're starting to break it down nation by nation. What nature does to us that we're like not recognizing. And they said in the paper, if ecosystem services were actually paid for, that's like in what you pay for your food, the global price system would be very different. And this is what I'm getting at about the problem with pricing versus so-called cheap conventional food and expensive organic food. So I have a paper coming out on this next month or March in the Maine Organic Farming Journal. But basically what I'm saying is organic practices conceptualized and evolved over the last century seamlessly align as key elements enhancing ecosystem services, which means we need to start looking at the real value of those and the fact that conventional farming is not paying for them. So let me just bring that home. I don't know why that's cut off like that, but a new view on economics is that organic is charging efficient prices. This was this stunning IMF report that came out just a year ago, and you should download it and read it. It's going to introduce you to entirely new concepts. What is a subsidy? So if a farmer uses chemical fertilizer that pollutes water, the cost of the water pollution has just been transferred somewhere else. The farmer didn't pay for that. The company didn't include it in the price. That's a subsidy. See, they're addressing us and saying that's a subsidy because the government ultimately has to fix it, right? And so they outline all the levels of real costs and hidden subsidies that are implicit in the way industry is working with this planet. And of course, they're using it to propose repricing of all fossil energy worldwide. And they go after the countries in which the price is not efficient. That means underpricing, ignoring the negative offsets. Somebody has to pay for those. And they're showing a rise. I mean, we're having now just environmental social effects is an enormous cost anymore. We're having people fleeing countries because of degradations of climate and so on. somebody's paying for that. So as a result of this, I'm saying in my paper that I'm coming out with, due to the ignored offsets, the costs apportioned to conventional farming have been incorrectly calculated. And we need to start pushing on this really hard. People criticize you for higher prices. You push right back and say, well, those lower prices, the assumption in those lower prices is that we can push the negative environmental, social, et cetera, costs off onto somebody else downstream. So I tried to kind of recapture this in the next slide, but the two big words you have to learn is what's an explicit subsidy and an implicit subsidy. And an explicit subsidy is when you don't correctly calculate the cost of delivery to you of a product, or they don't charge you for it because, or like road degradation from trucking is an explicit subsidy. Somebody's paying for it, but the shipper is not charging you for it. And then implicit subsidies are everything downstream, health effects of what you did, water pollution effects, and so on and so forth. Those all have a price. So what I'm proposing is that we create a balancing tool to show that the way we're pricing organic food meets the IMF standard of what they call an efficient price, a price that includes any costs of offsets, negative and positive, in the correct way. And so if you put organic and conventional in this picture, and here's all their negative offsets, and the explicit, the climate damage, pollution damage, health damage, and other forms of damage on the cost. This is a worldwide relative scale of costs, so you don't need to actually say what it is, and IMF says it's about $7 trillion in damage subsidies. But the conventional price versus the organic price of food has a differential about like this in the worst case. That's like a 50% price. But if this is true, we're paying for all the implicit and explicit subsidies in what we charge the customer, whereas conventional is just pushing it off to the side. And this is going to catch up to us. This is a difficult concept. I've been reworking this with the editor of the journal in Maine. She says, okay, people are going to ask this question, and it's not really clear what the scales mean because we've made it a relative scale. But you have to take responsibility if you have all those areas of subsidies involved in just giving a product or selling a product in the marketplace. If you can show that you've accounted for them and have charged for them, you have just alleviated society of that burden. And so we've got a smoke and mirrors economy right now that's working against us. So putting all this together is very exciting. I took some statistics from the Institute in Switzerland that has a great website for what's going on in the world with organic markets, produce, production, land area, and so on. And this is a really exciting table they showed of the trends in the last decade in the big debate, chemical is better, organic is better. And look at how the lines are moving. They're beginning to swing this way, and it's because of all the factors and forces involved, the understanding of offset negative balances that you have not correctly described to your customers, the awareness of anti-nutritional factors in conventionally grown food. We have to keep all this out there so people keep being aware, and they're doing a really good job of it. Denmark is outstanding. I didn't put Austria's on there. They're all the programs they're doing to help people become aware of the differences. And this goes down to politics as well. America lags. We're in 9th place in this movement. It's almost shameful. I go over to Europe to do organic or what they call biological farming discussions, and they say, what is going on in America? Why are you so far behind? We think we're leaders, but in terms of customer acceptance, we're not. And Europe is way ahead, so there's something different going along in how they're managing the information, and they're getting it out there into the public arena so that consumers are more aware of it, and they're standing up to all these forces. And that's why I say we need all the ammunition we can get in order to keep winning this and growing our market. So just to cycle back on that earthworm thing, I was once lampooned by somebody say, Will.Brinton believes in the value of earthworms, and he said it, this was an agronomist, said it in a derisive manner. Ireland just did a study on ecosystem services for the whole country. It's a really amazing report that shows you how fast some countries are moving forward in this arena. The value that earthworms provide farmers, $1.2 billion a year. It was an even million euros, so that's amazing. And so, and they put a value on the nutrient cycling, the reduced erosion, reduced nitrate in water due to earthworms. $1.2 billion ecosystem service. And an organic farmer should be able to say proudly, that's in the cost that you just paid us. We're taking care of them. We're growing them. The conventional farmer, what are they going to say? We don't care about that. Oh, we don't care about 1.2 billion in subsidies to the earthworms or hidden subsidies. So there's a lot of excitement as more and more of this kind of appreciation of ecosystem services is, and you need to go back and look at your farm and say, how do we describe our ecosystem services so our customers are more aware of it? You have to almost defend it. So let me give a big summary wrap-up of what I see as paths to growth going from here on. I think we've nailed the science. That's my opinion. It constantly gets debated. There's no consensus still. You can go to scientific congress after scientific congress, and it's 50-50 right down the room all the time, because every good study has another study detracting from it that's also published in a good journal. And this is the way science is. It's so super critical. But I believe we've nailed the science mostly. And I always say mostly because science is just a process. It's not a product. It's a process of study. It's a process of continuing openness to develop methods that help us see things that we haven't seen. But we've got to handle all the challenges, and I've listed them there, and I'm sure there's more. The whole challenge of no-till is enormous. I mean, how many of you are concerned about tillage? I won't ask for a show of hands, but they're driving at us that organic farmers are tillers. I heard Ray Archuleta give a talk, and he showed a picture of an organic farm, and he said, look at the destruction of soil on this farm. And these kinds of presentations by people formerly in NRCS, now on their own, are really, really damaging, because you have to stand up and defend it and say, first of all, it's all relative to the crop rotation. I was talking last night with Joe Heckman how within organic farming systems, crop rotation and long-term pastures were an implicit part of management. That's no-till, right? It's no-till that lasts a certain period of time, and then you break the cycle and go into something different, but it's managing no-till within the whole system. We have to learn to fight back. I'm seeing organic people capitulate to the tillage shame, we'll say, and don't let them do that to you. A little bit of tillage does wonderful things in turning things over. The study in Ohio last year that no-till is the cause of all the water pollution of the Great Lakes, because the soils are sealing over and then cracking, and the nutrients are falling all the way down to the drainage cells. That study just was stunning. And they put an $800 million a year cost on the damage that no-till in the wrong place is causing. But nobody will talk about it. So that includes the tillage destruction theories. I already mentioned crop rotation. I mean, I have farmers saying, I do corn and soy, that's a crop rotation. No, it's not. It's not really. And so we have to expand that discussion. The ideological argument, if you hear it, stand right up to it and say, if you call me an ideologue, you are too. You know, just make that clear to them. We're all living with these belief systems, and that early belief system that chemistry would conquer life and make it so much better, well, you know, the jury is still out on that. Finally, the yield gap is resolving itself. This is so wonderful. The more you look at it, the more good studies are showing we're doing better and better. And I did a tour of European organic farms and some of the new tillage equipment for weeding that they're coming out with. It's minimal disturbance, has lasers on it, can see a weed. And I mean, this is an amazing new technological development that will enable us to conquer these things without succumbing to use of chemicals. Finally, you need to address and stand up and recognize that we include ecosystem services in what we do. We are working with them, we are developing them. You could list it to your customers and say, ecosystem services is what we provide. Now, I've written a controversial, which will be a controversial paper saying organic farmers should not be selling their carbon into carbon markets. And the reason is, that's double payment for ecosystem services. It's not right. But we've got that out there as a thought. And finally, advertise your offsets. I mean, talk to people about what is a positive offset. That's an environmental benefit that a conventional farmer will tell you, you don't need to do that. You don't need to do that to produce a carrot or something. And you have to say, yes, because I need to do that because that's building the ecosystem basis of the farm. So these are some of the remarkable things that we have to look forward to. With that, I just want to thank you. I want to say something about my place in Maine. This farm is a small 25-acre farm. Has been the home of Woods End Lab for all this time, and now Woods End Lab is in a corporate office building in the city of Augusta, and it's moved off the farm. And so if you go to Maine, the Maine Farmland Trust website, you'll see a kind of a series of images and discussion about the opportunity that I'm opening up on our farm for some kind of new venture of building this consciousness, because we've got a lot of good equipment and some wonderful structures and possibilities there. So, you know, maybe some of you would like to move northwards and help us do that. And soil health tests, I'll talk a little bit about that in the breakout session when we speak about soil health management, but you can still go to my old website, woodsend.com, and get all that kind of work. So thank you very much for your attendance, and I look forward to more questions.
I think we as a community know we've been doing the right thing for a long time. Now it's so nice to see science telling us the same thing.